Hi there. Welcome to this lecture looking at this GCSE lecture for sociology, looking at the role of material factors versus cultural factors when trying to explain educational achievement and particularly the gaps in achievement between the different social classes. So as we move through this lecture, these are some of the concepts that I'm going to be covering, so I thought I'd explain them at the very beginning and you can make a note of them. Concepts such as the material factors refers to money and what money can buy. Material deprivation is being without the resources that money can buy that you'd expect to have, for example, an iPad or even your own bedroom. Cultural factors is about norms, values, parents' attitudes, language, traditions, religions, beliefs, all those things. And cultural deprivation is the idea that some groups lack the right norms and values and attitudes to be successful in society, particularly education. I'm also going to talk to you about labelling, which obviously happens within school. But this is when a label is attached, you attach a category or a stereotype to a person, you make a judgment, and it can have really powerful effects, and a label might even become true. Anti-school subcultures, these are groups of students within school that rebel, they form their own norms and values, and they're generally opposed to the dominant culture of the school, hence anti-school. And the final concept is sets, which we will have spoken about. But just to remind you, this is when students are put into ability groups across different subjects, depending on how well they are performing in each of their subjects. So what I'd like you to do is just make some notes, I think using your own knowledge. What sort of physical resources might help middle class students do better at school? Again, I say physical resources, it's kind of things that you can buy with money. So what things might middle class students have that might help them do better? And what sorts of resources might working class students not have access to that might actually hinder their education in a particular way? So what things might the working class lack access to, which means that they do less well in school in terms of a physical resource that you need money to buy? What norms or behaviours and values, which are things that are seen as important, might help middle class children do better in school? So what norms and values might they have or get passed on to them from their families that might help them do better in school? And what norms or behaviours what are the norms or behaviours that might stop the working class doing as well in school? I haven't put values on there, but you can also make a note if you want about what values might they lack, particularly in education, that might mean they do less well at school. So pause the lecture here and write down as many ideas and examples that you can think of for each of these four questions. Once you've done that activity, I'm going to just talk you through material factors, then cultural factors. And please make notes on what, not just what's on the slide, and be really clear about this. It would be much better for you if you actually made notes on, yes, what's on the slide, but also including some of the extra detail that I add as I explain it. So when it comes to material factors, and material factors to me are resources that you can use money to buy, the middle class benefit from material factors, whereas the working class are often deprived of these material resources. They suffer what's known as material deprivation. So let me just go through some, but not all, of the examples of the material factors that the middle class benefit from. They can afford private school, and the reason they benefit from private school, you can add this in, is because the class sizes are smaller, the resources might be better, and perhaps the teaching style might be better, but also most people within private school are pro-school as well. They can afford private tutors. So if they're in the state system and they're not doing so well in maths and English, they can actually afford a private tutor to support them to do better. They are more likely to have access to iPads, their own computer, and have a reliable internet connection. This is really important today when a lot of work is set digitally. Like imagine if you weren't able to access your online area for getting the schoolwork, you would really, really struggle to keep on top of deadlines. They can, of course, buy things like revision guides, or they can pay for online tutor resources as well. And they can have a good diet. So in here, you do need to add a bit more detail to your notes. So good diet is things like fresh fruit, lots of vegetables, fresh fish, meals cooked from scratch, lack of additives, less processed food. All of those things, cost money, but also take quite a lot of time. Okay, so the money aspect is definitely a material factor. Okay. Middle class far more like to have a large house. Large house is relevant because it means they can have their own bedroom, so that's good for study. But also that house might be in a catchment area near a good school. So good schools tend to drive up the house prices in the areas that they're in. So a middle class family could afford to make that move, whereas a working class family might not be able to. And even if they can't afford to move near a good school, they can actually afford to travel to a good school. They can afford a bus pass, they can afford a train ticket, or they have access to their own travel and their parents are able to get them there because they have their own car, or they've got more than one car in their household, for example. So that means they can travel further for a good school. So they don't have to go to their local school if it's not good. So like I mentioned, the working class are often deprived of these resources, and this is what's known as material deprivation. They have to go to state schools because they can't afford private school. Now, state schools are great. I clearly work in one. But state schools have larger class sizes. They're more likely to have more disruption. Less likely to have such a good resources, perhaps. And perhaps less support for students studying outside the classroom. They cannot afford private tutors, so if things aren't going great in English and maths, that's just the way it's happening, or any other subject. And they may have to share a computer, or they might have no home online access. They are limited to doing homework perhaps at school, in the library, or using their phone, but all of that might be problematic. They are more likely to have a poor diet because fresh food is expensive, like I mentioned before. Their parents might work really long hours because they've got low paid jobs, so they haven't got the time to cook like nutritious meals, and it might be a case of a microwave meal here, a microwave meal there. And I should mention, microwave meals are much cheaper, actually, as well, than some of the fresh food we were talking about. Working class, far more likely to live in a smaller house, so therefore not as likely to have their own bedroom, might have to share, so that's hard for revision and study. And they might live far from good schools, they might be in council estates, the local school might not be so good. And that's a problem because they will not be able to afford to travel. They haven't got the money to travel to good schools further away. They can only afford to walk to their local school, to travel to their local school. And if that local school is not a good one, then they are less likely to do as well. So those are material factors. There are others, but these are the material factors that I've thought of today. So cultural factors, these are your norms, values and attitudes. I tend to think of cultural factors as not physical resources you can buy, which is material. Cultural factors are the things like are inside your head. These are the things that affect how you think and act, okay, and the things you say. So these are the stuff that goes up in your head. So middle class families tend to pass on norms and values that benefit their children when in school. Whereas working class families pass on norms and values that actually might even harm their children's education, or they don't pass on the right norms and values. This is what's known as cultural deprivation. So middle class parents are far more likely to have been successful in school. They might have enjoyed it. They might have been positively labelled. So that enjoyment and positivity about school is quite likely to be reflected in their kids' attitudes. Okay, you need to say how this affects their attitudes. The parents will have had a job as a result of their qualifications from education, so they value education. They tell their kids that they need to kind of study and get good grades to get a good job, so they pass on that value to their kids. You've got to explain in your notes how this gets passed on to the kids. Parents' jobs actually might be a sort of role model for the children to aspire to. So the children might, want to do really well in maths because they want to go on and run a business like their mum did or something. Parents will attend parents' evening. And again, you need to add this in because they're more likely to value education. They're much more likely to be pro-school, the parents. So they value education. They go to parents' evenings, and that kind of gets passed on to their kids as, oh, my parents care. I need to work hard because my parents care. Parents are more likely to help with homework, again, because for them, education is important. It is normal to do homework, they would say. It is also perhaps because they have the knowledge as well to help with the homework, but middle-class parents are far more likely to do this. Generally, middle-class parents are more likely to be supportive of teachers. So if a child does get into trouble or they don't do their homework, then the parents are far more likely to be supportive of the school and say, yep, you need to follow the rules, you need to do what your teacher tells you, because that's the right thing. And then that means that the child is more likely to be pro-school. They're more likely to agree with the rules and conform to the rules, if you like, which means they're more likely to benefit in school from things like positive labelling, which I'll talk to you about shortly. This is interesting. We haven't. The parents will actually research. Middle class parents are far more likely to do the research to figure out which are the good schools to send their kids to, whether that's an infant school, a secondary school. Middle class parents are far more likely to look at the league tables. They're far more likely to go around to all the different schools and ask questions to figure out which is the best school that gets the best results. And because the parents value education, this is where we sort of connect, I guess, cultural with material. Because middle class parents value education, they will spend money on education because they value it so much. So if they didn't value it, then they wouldn't, buy revision guides or pay for tutors. So it's important to have that value for education in order to then agree to spend money on it. And finally, we have touched on this in class. Middle class parents will socialise their children into an elaborate speech code because most middle class people do speak in elaborate speech code, which is it's formal, it's more complex vocabulary, and that benefits the children, to do well because the teachers are more likely to speak elaborate. The exam papers are written in elaborate, so that benefits them when they go into school. Whereas working class families are far more likely to suffer what's known as cultural deprivation. The parents might have had a negative view of school, they didn't enjoy it, they suffered negative labels, they do not like school, and that can get passed on to their kids. That attitude can get passed on to their kids, which means they're more likely to be anti-school. Parents perhaps didn't need qualifications for the jobs they do. I don't know, maybe they work in, building, for example, or bricklaying. And maybe they didn't need qualifications. So well, what's the point? There's no value. You don't need it. You don't need to do well in school. Parents might not attend parents' evenings. Again, they don't like school. So why would they bother? They don't care, perhaps, about their child's performance. And that will really get passed on to the kid. They're like, well, that doesn't matter if I don't do well. It doesn't matter if I misbehave. My parents don't care about it. The parents either don't help with homework because they're like, well, why bother with homework? Why should you be doing homework at home? And that's like an attitude that gets passed on to kids. Or maybe they can't help with homework because they haven't got the right knowledge to help with the homework. Quite often, working class parents are a bit more likely to side with the children, not the teachers. So if a child gets a homework detention, a working class parent might be like, they're not doing that detention. Why should they? I refuse for them to have that detention. And then that means that child sort of starts to think, well, I don't need to do that work. I don't need to work hard because I don't have to do the detentions. Working class parents either don't care about what schools are good, so they generally send their kids to the local school, or it's a lack of understanding. They don't understand how to go about choosing a good school. The system's complicated. They just assume that everyone goes to the local school, and they don't really maybe realise perhaps that there's problems in the local school. They might be really impressed by, I don't know, the sports pitch, but not be aware that the results might not be good perhaps. And ultimately they don't have that money for the education resources. That's in the wrong section. Just ignore that one for the no money for education resources. I should have deleted that one, sorry. So ignore that one. Finally, working class parents are more likely to socialise their children into restricted speech codes. They're more likely to speak in slang, more likely to perhaps swear, which means that they're less able to understand the taught curriculum, less able to understand and interact with the teachers. And because of that restricted speech code, teachers are more likely to have a negative view of them. So there's a bit of evaluation. Hopefully, as you've been listening to some of this cultural stuff, particularly about working class, you've been screaming, this is really unreasonable, this is really unfair. That's not true. And that's right. There are some problems with this debate about working class being culturally deprived. So I'm going to nip through some of these with some evaluation for you. So the ones I've highlighted in blue are the ones I'm going to evaluate. So if you're a cultural deprivation sociologist, you believe that they fail because they haven't got the right norms and values. Sorry. However, if a parent didn't get the right qualifications, they don't have a good job, they actually might want their child to do better. So they might really value education. They might not want their child to end up working in Sainsbury's for all their life. They might want them to do better. So they might push them harder. So yeah, I think working class parents can value education. And Working class parents might want to attend parents' evenings, but they can't because they might be working and they're more likely to do shift work, night work, or they can't get childcare. So it's not a lack of value of education that stops them going to parents' evening. It's just the practicalities about being able to get there. Again, the same point for if they don't or can't help with homework. Maybe they're just not even in the house. Maybe they're working. Okay, so they can't help with that homework. They might want to, but they just can't because they're not there. And then the point about parents don't care or understand choosing a good school, that thing is they may still really value education. They may want to get their kid into a good school, but they can't afford to move or travel to an area with good schools. Their options are really limited because of the material factors that I mentioned on the previous slide. So please make note of some of these evaluation points, because they're basically saying that, hang on, the reason the working class don't do well is not necessarily because their parents don't value education. There must be other reasons to explain why they don't do well, because many working class parents are really aspirational and want their children to do well. Another thing I want to talk to you about in terms of evaluation is that many of the material factors and cultural factors that happen at home can affect what happens in schools. So I think it's not enough to say, yeah, the reason the working class fails is because they haven't got enough material resources or because they don't value the right things. Actually, it's more complicated. There are things that happen in school linked to these things that make failure or success more or less likely, depending on which class you're in. So if a parent cannot afford the correct uniform, or they cannot update the uniform so the uniform doesn't fit, like a skirt or something, then the child, and that's a material factor because it's money, a student may end up being disciplined at school and as a result end up with a negative label. Like we know that students not wearing uniform correctly is a big trigger for negative labels in schools. Or if a student speaks restricted code, I mentioned this before, so they speak in a heavy accent, they use slang, maybe they swear a bit more, they're far more likely to be labelled negatively in schools. But if a student fails to do revision, as there's no space or resources at home, and those are material factors because they haven't got enough space and they can't afford revision resources, so they might do less well in assessments, so therefore they end up in lower sets. So being in a low set we know can affect achievement. And if parents don't value education, then their child is far more likely to end up in an anti-school subculture. And there are others. If you want to have a go at connecting some material factors or cultural factors to things that happen at school, please do. But my main point here, guys, is just to say that it's not enough to just say it's only material factors or it's only cultural factors. Quite often, these things that happen at home can also lead to things in school that will also negatively affect a working class child's achievement. The opposite of all of these is true for the middle class, I should mention. So the middle class can afford nice uniforms, so they're more likely to have positive labels. The middle class speak elaborate codes, they get positively labelled. The middle class are more likely to be able to revise, they have the space, they're more likely to end up in top set. The middle class is more likely to value education, they're more likely to end up in pro-school subcultures. So you are welcome to add those notes if you have space or time. So I guess the final point just to finish off on this lecture is, do you think material factors are the main cause of working class underachievement, or do you think it's cultural factors? You could do this on a bit of lined paper. This is not an official exam question. It's a bit like a 15-mark question, but it's not quite. But yeah, it's good practice to have a go at answering it. And in terms of the structure, here we go. You want to make sure you've got a nice clear point. I believe that material factors can explain working class underachievement, that should say, because, you need to finish your point, you then need to explain it fully with evidence, which I mean like an example to illustrate it, and then you need to link it back to the question which I've given you. This causes working class underachievement because exact language of the question, that's what the examiner's looking for. Next paragraph. However, some would argue that cultural factors better explain why the working class underachieve because. So pick a cultural point to make there. Explain it fully with evidence, and then of course link back to the question. And if this was a proper 15-mark essay, you would need a point 3. So what could be your other point, your third point? And you would also need a conclusion at the end where you make a judgment about which is the strongest argument that you've made. Or is it a mixture? Thanks so much for listening. Definitely make sure that you've added in some of the extra bits that I've said. Go back and re-listen to bits if you need them for revision. And hopefully this has been helpful.